Thank you, Seema. With your permission, I will speak from here. And thank you to Madhavan and Chakshu for asking me to come for this. I've been listening very carefully to what the honorable MPs have been saying, and I would just like to a few comments on what they said. This is a session on Parliament and the Executive. I think one thing came through very clearly in what the honorable MP, Mr. Premchandran, said, that while the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive are in some senses the three arms, there is no dispute about the fact that the executive is subordinate to the legislative. There is, it's good to get this clear at some point, because apart from anything else, the legislature has the powers to chastise the executive. And sometimes there are a lot of problems because civil servants don't entirely understand this. But having said that, let me say this, that why is the legislature so important for the executive? And in my mind, it's really because the legislature asks questions that your own minister is not asking you. Because at the end of the day, once the hurly-burly of elections is done and the government is sworn in and there is a minister, in some ways the minister becomes part of the team. And if there is an issue, if there is a problem, I mean, I can just give you an example. Years ago when I was Agriculture Secretary in Lucknow, we had a terrible fertilizer crisis and the minister was being bombarded with complaints, and he would call me and then I would explain whatever it was, and he would basically just sort of listen to me he was a very nice man, very politely, and then say, "Dekh lijiyega," and that was it. Whereas Assembly would never do that. I mean, when we appeared before the standing committee for our department in the same Lucknow, they gave us hell, saying, you know, they were not, I mean, my minister sort of just looked at me and sort of basically said, handle it. Say something. So this is why it is important. And the Honourable MP mentioned questions. Questions are extremely important. It's a pity that, I mean, with respect, nobody seems to be taking this as seriously as it used to be taken. Extraordinary amounts of information can be extracted through the means of questions. In the Health Ministry, it's only because of questions every year on Japanese encephalitis from the MPs in Gorakhpur and Basti that this matter was always on our agenda. My minister used to know the data more or less by heart because it was coming up again and again. It's very important, the tool of questions. Even more importantly, and I'm very glad the Honourable MP mentioned it, standing committees, parliamentary standing committees can play an extraordinary role in, well, most importantly, in improving the quality of legislation. Again, if I can just fall back on my own experience, we had a standing committee on health and family welfare that dissected every line of the draft mental health care bill of 2013. And it was an exercise that was extremely important because things that I took for granted, things that I assumed, things that I believed in, everything had to be defended before that committee. Why are you saying this? What is the meaning of this? And I was very struck and very impressed by the willingness and capacity of the standing committee to listen. And we gave them a list of experts to be called, and they invited them and listened to their points of view. Then they actually asked me, who are the people who don't like this bill? And I said, we've given you those names also. And they called them. Now, so I'm not saying this happens invariably, but it certainly can happen. And the executive, really, civil servants, secretaries, joint secretaries, should learn to work with the standing committee because that is your only door into Parliament. The debate on the floor of the House is never going to go into that level of detail. And quite often, again, in my experience, if the standing committee's report is tabled in the House and they have said, yes, broadly do this with the following amendments, that is the mood of the House, because it is all parties are represented in the standing committees, and there is a very detailed report of the standing committee. They seem to think it's all right. It sets the tone for the discussion when the bill is taken up for passing by voice vote, which is what usually happens if the standing committee has done its job well. So there has to be a very constructive and lively relationship between the instruments of Parliament and the executive, and it's possible. And it's increasingly sad that this sort of thing is not really happening. Now, two other points have come up in the discussion on which there was some talk earlier about ordinances. Madhavan mentioned it in his introductory remarks. I mean, an ordinance is only an instrument. It can be misused, but it certainly can be used. Again, if I can just fall back on my experience in May 2010, when the then President of the Medical Council of India was taken to jail, it was clear from what the public was saying, from what the press was saying, from what Parliament was saying, that government had to take steps. And that is when we took to the President, following Cabinet approval, an ordinance to set aside the Medical Council of India and put in its place something else. That story had a sad ending, but the point is, at that point of time, that was the only thing that had to be done. It was the only thing that could be done, and it was unanimously accepted by Parliament. And when 6 weeks later, when we took that ordinance back to Parliament to be enacted, it was again immediately approved by, without any delay of any sort. So, and there will always be situations when you really cannot wait for Parliament to reconvene, when there is a crisis of one sort or the other. But certainly, as this point has also come out, ordinances can be misused, and specifically when you know that it's going to be defeated if it's moved as a bill. And that is unfortunate. The other question, this point has come up in the discussion about the role of the courts. And the Honourable MP very interestingly said that it's the business of the executive to do the drafting, and it's the business of the legislature to do the approving of the bill. But to this I would add that it then becomes the business of the judiciary to interpret the law. Because no law is frozen, and we all know the importance of case law. We know how specific sections are interpreted without any amendments being made to the text of the law itself, but different courts give different interpretations at different times, and the whole thing is an evolving process. Now, is there too much court interference? Again, court interference happens basically when the executive is not doing its job. When there is a situation that is clearly crying out for a solution, and that solution is not happening, or it's not being done, or that is when people go to court, because they have no recourse from what should normally be. I mean, you see in the newspapers all the time instances of the kind of things that courts are passing judgments on, which in a strong working administrative system should have sorted these things out. And I think it's inevitable if it's a system where different people have responsibilities and one of them is not exercising those responsibilities, somebody else is going to move in onto your territory, and the more they move in, the more they like it, and the better use they get to it, and then it's rather grand because you can just keep on doing this sort of stuff. Now, in the same context, and the last thing I want to say is, I think one thing we all need to worry about is, yes, executive, legislature, judiciary are three aspects and checks and balance, etc. But what happens if all three are wrong? And just one example comes to mind. The Supreme Court recently upheld the decision of the Haryana government that people who did not have built toilets in their houses could not contest panchayat elections. Now, this seems to me, and I hope I'm not being contemptuous if I say this, but on the face of it, this seems to me wrong. But this is something that clearly the executive signed off on, that the Haryana Assembly passed, and the Supreme Court has upheld. So what happens in a situation like this? So all the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted, and there is no constitutional infirmity in this whole process, but it's a wrong order. And I think the only thing that can happen is, when there is a different government, that government will, since if I recall correctly, the Supreme Court took the very lofty position that what Haryana did was within its powers. It did not really go into the merits of this toilet story, but that, yes, it is open, a duly elected legislature can pass an order of this nature. So perhaps we have to wait for a new government that takes something back to the, presumably a new assembly in Haryana, and changes this. But there's no solution before that. Because so I think that is something we need to be careful about. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mr. Desiraju.